From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Ahead today, K-State's Dan O'Brien will talk about the USDA's latest U.S. grain production report, which featured surprisingly friendly numbers for the corn and soybean markets, and he'll comment on the possible corn market impact from year-round sales of E15 ethanol. During Dan's weekly segment on the grain price trends, he'll be followed by K-State's Doug Jardine talking about several corn, grain, sorghum, and soybean disease problems in Kansas fields that have been likely aggravated by the persistent wet weather of late. He'll talk about the marketing and storage factors that you need to consider as you eventually harvest those crops. And K-State's Mary Knapp will be in to let us know how soon the weather will let you back into those fields. All that and more right here on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
This is Agriculture Today, coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. Well, we've no lack of talking points in our session on the grain markets this week. Standing by via phone once more is Research and Extension grain market economist Dan O'Brien. Dan, we have a USDA, World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates report with some unexpected numbers on corn and soybeans to share, along with much more. But briefly here, you and your colleagues out of the Agricultural Economics Department at K-State put on 2 agricultural lenders conferences earlier this week. They were well attended, great response, we're told. What was on the lender sector's mind as far as the grain markets as you interacted with those attendees?
Well, I think that they were a very serious but quasi-upbeat group. Again, no doubt having fairly good harvest numbers coming in, with bushels for sale on the grain side was a positive thing. I don't think there's anybody that's naive with regard to the financial stresses that are out there. Of course, for the topic I was talking about, there were questions about whether we could expect post-harvest price recoveries for corn, for grain, sorghum, for soybeans, and they were looking for any ideas they could get about grain marketing strategies, where we might go with wheat markets in the coming years. So it just strikes me that when you're in a harvest season here, you have a set of markets that are really reflective of, I wouldn't say pessimism, but a sober-minded market low mentality. And in midst of that, still you didn't see people on the ag lending or other agribusiness side that were at those meetings that were bemoaning the situation. They were just looking to see how best to manage in light of what at least currently are low prices, and wondering about the possibilities in the coming year of things improving market-wise.
Well, again, to the aforementioned USDA report out yesterday, those numbers provided a favorable bump, if you will, for the corn and soybean markets, and the crops not quite reaching expectations as far as the numbers read.
Yes, I think, Eric, the biggest story coming out of these reports is that it's not overtly bearish. We had a USDA report, well, a couple of them, the crop production report and the supply demand estimates report, that although they did show sizable production numbers, again, for corn, 14.778 billion bushels, and for soybeans, 4.69, you had numbers that weren't higher than the September estimates. And just by virtue of being below what had been expected generally on average, the markets responded positively to that. And we saw that December corn futures closed yesterday up 6.5 cents. November, 6 cents higher, and generally the complex for the first few months, we're all following that. The wheat side closed about 2.5 cents lower. But again, that's not a lot of movement. It wouldn't have been unexpected at all to have seen the USDA come in towards the top of the pre-report estimate range of crop size at 15.2 billion bushels or 15 billion or more. That really wouldn't have surprised anyone. Wouldn't have surprised anyone to see the production number move to the higher side, closer to 4.75 or 4.8, but that didn't happen. And since it didn't happen, that was viewed as a positive. So we take those production numbers, run them through the balance sheets, and then see what the ending stocks figures are. But really, I think there's a lot of important trend information to consider on the way there, particularly in what the USDA did on the usage side.
So is this the kind of development with this October report that might have some staying power in support of the markets? We have another report due out in November, which may be even more telling.
Yes, and this report represented conditions as of October the 1st. Again, if we have harvest delays, other crop quality issues, particularly for soybeans, as we're hearing out of the southeast, there may be some more whittling away of the production numbers, or at least an acknowledgement that we have some quality problems in some places. So interesting, by the time you've come to the September report and now the October report and haven't had a huge surprise large number out there, it does set the tone, I think, for us to, wonder about whether we're as low as we're going to go for this fall. And if so, then people can start to really gauge what a storage strategy can do, or if they're pessimistic on the basis, they could sell and then figure out what to do thereafter in terms of some type of reownership through call options or whatever. Anyway, the point is that by avoiding a huge negative response in the market, now I think we're setting our sights on just asking the question of, well, where might demand take us as we move off into November, December, January?
And to that effect, any signals one way or the other evident this week in as far as grain exports?
Strong numbers for corn. The actual shipments came in at 53 million bushels. The USDA with this actually had raised their projection by about 75 million bushels on what would be happening in this market in Europe to 2.475. Even with that higher projection, we need about 48 million bushels to meet the USDA's this new estimate, and came in at 53. So, gosh, that's a positive on the corn side. When you look at other items in that balance sheet, you see the USDA holding fairly decent on its projection for feed usage, 5.55 billion bushels, down 25 million bushels, but that's kind of rounding error when you're talking about that many bushels. Ethanol number, no change at 5.65 billion bushels. And really what's at issue there, I think, is that, again, this report came out almost the same day of the announcement of E15 being available year-round, and optimism on the part of corn growers with regard to corn usage and demand, of what that could do to help support movement and lower stocks. Of course, the folks that tend to be pretty cautious about that thing, or sometimes just resistant to it because of their place in the fuel industry, talking about the other side. So will E15 bring about even greater amounts of corn usage to take this 5.6 billion bushel up to 6.5, 7? It's possible. Who will decide that finally? It will be consumers. So I'm sure that people in the corn industry will be doing everything they can to help make that happen. But still, it's an open question as to what E15 will do for corn usage as opposed to E10.
We'll finish on this. You are regularly keeping tabs on harvest time basis activity and news at our Kansas delivery points, our elevators around the state. What have you identified as something out of the ordinary, if anything at all, this past week, Dad?
Well, several things. When you look at basis bids in western and central Kansas, it's hard not to notice and be impressed by the strength of corn basis bids out in southwest Kansas. The strongest bids in the whole state are in not very large communities in terms of people living there, but ones that have a lot of cattle around them, I think. Sublette, Ulysses, both positive basis to December. Other bids, around Garden City, around Dodge City, Protection, really most of those southwest Kansas communities, all within 10, at the most 20 cents under D's futures. So that stands out. And again, that's a demand center in the state, and you see that positively. You also see strong corn basis at the ethanol plants, a range of from 15 under to 20 over for basis bids on yesterday's markets. Grain sorghum bids, also at ethanol plants, at 20 under, but that's really stronger than you see in most other areas of the state. It does look like grain sorghum basis bids are starting to recover some. And again, you see that with a little bit of export business in the last week, about 2.4 million bushels. Really the first week we had anything other than just a small amount. So that's a very positive bit of news for the grain sorghum market. And you can see it in some of the basis numbers. We have basis bids in Topeka on the one hand and Wellington, Ark City on the other that are 45, 50 under. And, we have been running at that or wider as we were struggling to see what movement we might have at coming out of elevators off into export channels. So now, again, when you look at, especially when I noticed the Topeka bid being at 45 under, when we had strong exports in Kansas grain sorghum markets before Chinese tariffs came in, some of the strongest bids were coming out of those eastern Kansas locations, Topeka in particular. So to see Topeka starting to narrow up again, it's probably indicative of export business starting to come alive again for grain sorghum. So that's, if you're a grain sorghum producer wanting to move the product, that's a good bit of news.
Excellent. Well, Dan, we will catch up with you again next week right here in Manhattan. The annual Research and Extension Conference will hold forth here at the university, so we'll talk one-on-one about the markets at that time. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
Grain market analysis and comment from Dan O'Brien, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension, joining us from his office in Colby, Northwest Kansas. And as always, you can see more about what Dan shared with us right here in his weekly notes on the grain trades. Those are now posted at agmanager.info. Well, Dan mentioned it, one of the market uncertainties, possible corn and soybean crop condition issues stemming from the recent abundant rainfall. That is a distinct possibility here in Kansas, as our next guest will tell us. He'll be with us shortly here on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Agriculture Today continues now, and you're all aware of the ample, if not excess, moisture around the state of Kansas in the recent week or so, and that has just lent to more potential problems in our unharvested row crops around Kansas. Covering what may be out there in field now is Doug Jardine, row crop disease specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Doug, this could well be anticipated when you have such persistent moisture. Standing crops are bound to load up on disease problems, are they not?
Well, Eric, you're partially right. We're not looking at any new disease problems, but what we're really looking at is those that are already out there getting potentially far, far worse. And, that's across all of our crops, really. So it was pertinent today to come and talk a little bit about some of these issues. Let's
pick up on corn diseases. Molds are highly likely in those saturated fields, aren't they?
Right. And we're particularly worried about 2 molds. And earlier this summer, we were talking about aflatoxin. And while wet weather will, if mold wasn't there, it would prevent it from showing up. When it's already on the ear, this wet weather is going to allow it to continue to grow, and depending on the moisture of that grain, potentially pump out more aflatoxin. We especially would be concerned about grain that is maybe around 20% moisture, 22% moisture, and it's not drying now because of the wet weather and the fungus is there, and so potentially aflatoxin could continue to build. And I have been doing some checking with some of the testing laboratories, They've actually not received a lot of samples to this point. I think some of that is because a lot of the worst corn was chopped or baled or otherwise, so there wasn't actual grain to test. So the majority of the samples that they've tested are over 20 parts per billion, which is what we consider safe for human consumption, but they've been under 100, which is kind of the benchmark of what we use for feeding particularly cattle. And so with most of them under 100, I think we're in pretty good shape. But they have had an occasional one come in over 300, and that's a real red light there because over 300 you don't have any use for it. We're not allowed to, at least legally, to blend grain down without an exemption from the FDA, and at this point we don't have that. I don't know if we'd be seeking that yet or not. We did in 2012, and it was granted, but it remains to be seen. So I think overall we're in pretty good shape on that, but again, if it's on the ear and it's out there and you can't get out to harvest it at that high moisture, we could see things get a little worse with that regard.
So don't let your guard down on potential aflatoxin,
right,
even though the possibilities may be somewhat limited.
And the other ear mold that we're very concerned about is Fusarium ear mold and a close cousin called Gibberella because they produce their own toxins. The Fusarium ear mold produces fumonisin, and we had a scare with that last year. And we had very similar conditions last year to what we have right now. It was rainy, and we couldn't get the grain out, and especially in the Texas Panhandle, it was much worse than it was here in southwestern Kansas. And so I think people need to be cautious. Again, they've not received a lot of samples in testing for fumonisin, but most of them that have been coming in are in the 20 to 25 parts per million range. 4 is considered safe for human consumption, but again, for cattle feeding, you can go up to 60. So depending on what the use of that grain is, it's good or bad. We're okay for cattle yet, but if you're growing food-grade corn under contract, there might be some issues there. The other related one is Gibberella. It's not one that we frequently see, but it does occasionally happen. It would be more of a problem maybe in western Kansas where they got some rains during tasseling and pollination. And now with these continued rains, there could be more. It has a very distinct red color, and it's the same fungus that causes head scab in wheat. So the vomitoxin and the DON would be the toxins that would go along with that. Again, I've not heard of any, but as I think about potentials, that would be one that would be on my list to keep an eye out for.
So stay alert. And you do have some worries, you say, as well, about stalk rots accelerating, to put it that way, in standing corn.
Right. So depending on where you're at in the state, the primary stalk rots are Fusarium stalk rot and Anthracnose stalk rot. And from a grower standpoint, honestly, it doesn't matter which one you have. But the continued wet weather will allow them to develop. The stalks will start to lose integrity, and the risk of lodging go up significantly. And so, if you can't get out in the field and, we get, a good 40 or 50 mile an hour wind gust, all of a sudden we're crawling across the field to try and pick that corn up. And time is money when you're harvesting. And so growers should be out evaluating. There's not a lot of corn. We're over halfway done, but the corn that's still out there, they should be going out and maybe doing the push test where you push a stalk about 45-degree angle. If it springs back, you're good. If it kinks over, you've got a problem. And if you've got too many stalks with a problem, then you probably need to target that field for rapid harvest and leave the little bit healthier fields for later on.
And if it is really bad, you may be thinking about alternatives for harvesting via cattle.
Well, that's at least for some guys, that's an option, not for everybody.
Right. Over to grain sorghum, and there is a specific mold condition that you think may well be amplified now likewise.
Well, yeah, and we generically call it head mold, and there are, here in Kansas, 3 or 4 different fungi that can cause that. And basically what you see is a black fuzzy coating over the kernels, and it reduces the quality of the grain. There's no toxins associated with most of these fungi, so from that standpoint, we're okay. But it might cause some grain to be rejected at the elevator if you had too much of it, or you might get some feed refusal from the livestock if it's too high a portion of the ration. And so, again, the sorghum has looked great, but if we get to the point where it's being left out in the field way past its optimum time for harvest because you just can't get in there, there is some potential, especially in the cream-colored sorghums or the white-colored sorghums. They tend to be more susceptible to that problem. And so, again, producers should just keep an eye out for that, and if they see some head mold issues starting to develop in those fields, they might want to target those as best as possible for a little bit earlier harvest. And again, putting grain into storage, it's never going to come out better than when it went in. And so grain storage conditions, both with the molds in corn and the head molds in sorghum, you want to dry that grain as rapidly as you can down to the 12 to 14% range. Best you can, try and keep the humidity under 50 degrees and the temperature below 50 degrees. And now that we've got some colder nights, we can run those fans and we probably can get some cooling of the grain. So that's going to be helpful to some extent.
And you wanted to alert soybean growers particularly to what you describe in broad terms as weathering diseases out there prompted by the wet conditions.
So there are a group of diseases that really don't have any foliar symptoms or ones that aren't real noticeable. And the most common ones would be Cercospora leaf blight, which when it infects the seed, turns the seed purple, and so we call that purple seed stain. There's Phomopsis pod and stem blight, which will cause a shriveling and sometimes a white crust to form on the seeds. And you'll see oftentimes on the stems little black pimple-like structures that line up in pretty straight rows. And that's where the reproductive spores of the fungus will be produced. And then the third disease is called anthracnose, and it causes a blotchiness on the stems and on the pods to some extent, and again can cause some darkening or discoloration of the seed, all of which become quality issues when you take the grain to the elevator, and yield issues as well. Some of that shriveled grain will get blown out the back of the combine, which is actually probably a good thing because you don't want to take it up to the elevator, but you're losing yield at that point. And we have already heard with purple seed stain in particular of a couple of loads being flat out rejected at some elevators here in the state. So that's going to be a concern. And again, that disease will get worse the longer the soybeans stand out in the field. And also today, just on social media, I've seen there's a lot of shattering of pods going on now with all this wet weather. So that just compounds the problem. But these diseases really need to be reckoned with. And there's really nothing we can do at this point. Again, if they're going into storage, you need to be conscious of getting that grain cooled and dried as possible. These diseases all can be treated with fungicides, but that fungicide needs to go on about the R5 or beginning pod fill stage. And again,
a while back.
And again, at that time, they don't have any foliar symptoms. You don't know if they're going to be there or not. So, do you bite the bullet and spend the money for something that may or may not develop, sort of insurance, or do you let it ride and hope that you don't get a lot of rain? Well, this year, if you did the latter, you're paying for it. So it becomes just a little bit of guesswork there, whether you want to put that fungicide down or not. I think always the case is the higher the yield potential and the higher the price, the more that makes sense. And this year we've had a lot of fields with not a lot of great yield potential, and price is obviously not good. So maybe in the long run you were better off not treating. So
the risk factor is always there in grain production, but the main message here, you want producers, corn, grain, sorghum, and soybeans to be aware of these conditions and what they might do, if anything, in response, particularly when it comes to storage.
So the bottom line is, get them out of the field as fast as you can.
Right. And hopefully that will come along soon with favorable weather drying our fields out around Kansas. Doug, as always, thank you.
You're welcome.
A quick roundup there on what the recent wet weather in Kansas might have prompted in the way of disease problems in our row crops around the state. Doug Jardine is a row crop disease specialist with K-State Research and Extension. We'll have more after this break on Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and continuing on now with today's agricultural news headlines. Well, the Kansas numbers were part of that USDA crop production report released yesterday. Based on the conditions as of October the 1st, the corn crop in the state forecast at 663 million bushels, down 3% from last year's production. Harvested acreage at 5.1 million acres, down 2% from a year ago. And the corn yield in Kansas forecast at 130 bushels per acre. That's down 2 bushels from last year. Grain sorghum forecast at 241 million bushels, up 20% from last year. Harvested acreage at 2.65 million, up 8% from last year. And the sorghum yield, a record forecast at 91 bushels per acre, up 9 bushels from last year. And Kansas soybean production, a record forecast at 198 million bushels, up 3% from last year. Bean acreage at 4.7 million, 8% below 2017. And the soybean yield forecast at 42 bushels per acre, up 4.5 bushels from last year. Other crops, cotton production, a record forecast at 335,000 bales, up 70% from last year. Canola production forecast at 28.6 million pounds. That is forecast on a basis of 840 pounds per acre, which is down 480 pounds per acre from 2017. And the all sunflower production is forecast at 71.8 million pounds, down 19% from last year. Weed scientists here at Kansas State University have confirmed populations of kochia in western Kansas that show cross-resistance to both dicamba and fluroxypyr. Dicamba resistance in kochia isn't new. It was first documented in Montana many years ago. Isolated populations found in other Great Plains states. This according to K-State weed scientist Vipin Kumar. Glyphosate resistance also common in this troublesome weed, but the cross-resistance is new for Kansas because fluroxypyr was working pretty well here, says Vipar, and has been used a lot, especially in wheat, to take care of kochia. Fluroxypyr, a Group 4 herbicide common in many herbicide premixes in wheat and in corn. This discovery could seriously complicate kochia control, especially if dicamba use continues to grow with the use of extend crops, according to Vipar. The good news is that the resistant weeds, which were identified near Garden City and Hayes, could have what he calls a fitness cost, since that has been the case with other dicamba and fluroxypyr-resistant kochia populations identified in other states. That means that weeds could produce less seed and grow more slowly and eventually be outcompeted by other susceptible weeds, but that's only if dicamba and fluroxypyr aren't used on them for several generations. And that would be unlikely, says Vipar, since glyphosate resistance was identified in kochia in Kansas 11 years ago. Dicamba and fluroxypyr use in the state has risen dramatically. And he notes that he will be doing a survey of western Kansas kochia to see how prevalent the dicamba and fluroxypyr cross-resistance truly is. And a quick thing to get on your calendar. U.S. Secretary of Agriculture Sonny Perdue will be the next speaker in Kansas State University's Landon Lecture Series. The Secretary's speech will be, quoting here, "Leave it better than you found it, lessons in public service I have learned on the farm." That will be at 10:30 the morning of Thursday, November the 1st in McCain Auditorium. The lecture free and the public is invited. We'll be talking more about the Secretary's appearance as we go along here, but again, it's scheduled for Thursday, November the 1st, Sonny Perdue with the next Landon Lecture here at Kansas State University. Thanks to rapid and unprecedented advances in technology, the wheat breeding program here at K-State is on the cusp of major strides forward in variety development, and the relative swiftness in new variety releases could well be impressive. Marcia Boswell has more on this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Marcia?
The wheat breeding program at Kansas State University is about more than just developing new wheat varieties for Kansas. While the release of superior varieties is an end goal of the program, many other aspects benefit Kansas farmers. K-State has 2 wheat breeders. Dr. Alan Fritz runs the Manhattan program and develops hard red winter wheat varieties for eastern and central Kansas. and Dr. Golrong Zhang runs the Haze program and develops hard red winter and hard white varieties for central and western Kansas. The programs are funded by Kansas State University, Kansas Wheat Commission, and Kansas Wheat Alliance. The funding from wheat farmers is used for operation of the program, including staff time to plant and harvest in excess of 20,000 yield plots per year, equipment purchases and upkeep, and travel to plots across the state. The program employs graduate students and postdoctoral research assistants who graduate and go on to work in other public and private breeding programs. These breeders will in turn shape the future of the wheat industry, but their roots will be firmly planted in their training in Kansas. Development of a new wheat variety is a long-term process. It takes about 12 years from the initial greenhouse cross until that new variety is available to farmers. With new technologies available, that development time is decreasing. These new technologies include high-throughput phenotyping, genomic selection, doubled haploids, speed breeding, and DNA markers. Dr. Fritz says we're really on the front edge of implementing these things and putting them into the breeding program and learning how to harness their power. With the recent completion of the sequence of the wheat genome, the industry is on the forefront of additional technological advances. The wheat genome sequence allows researchers to have a tool to guide them while experimenting with valuable traits for Kansas wheat farmers at a more rapid pace. Because of the continued long-term investment in the program, breeders are able to work on projects that won't provide a return on investment in the short term. One of these allows them to bring in the diversity of wild relatives of wheat. Fritz says the genetic diversity that we're bringing in will benefit all of the wheat community. With these benefits, it makes sense that the K-State breeding program only releases varieties that offer an improvement over the other varieties in the marketplace. Fritz says their release philosophy has always been relatively conservative. They don't release a wheat just so farmers will have another choice to sort through. He says, in general, we've really tried to make sure that when we bring something forward through the Kansas Wheat Alliance, it is what we think is a really good fit for production and has real value on acres. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia. Well, is more harvest and wheat planting friendly weather ahead in Kansas? We'll find out from Mary Knapp next on Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today, 800-321-3276, or visit us online, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions. Now for you on Agriculture Today, Kansas agricultural weather and the latest from the Weather Data Library here at K-State, alongside Research and Extension climatologist Mary Knapp. Mary, at long last, we can declare the exceptional drought in Kansas over with. The recent rains have pretty much wiped that out, you say?
Yes. Finally, we've got some of the heavier rain into the most severely affected drought areas, particularly Wyandotte and southern Leavenworth County, which is where the exceptional drought had still lingered. They did get generous rains in that area, and they actually had a 2-category improvement with the recent drought monitor update. So exceptional and extreme drought have been erased from the map. We still have moderate and severe drought lingering around in many places. We'll note that at our monitoring station in Miami County, our soil moisture is basically saturated all the way down to the 8-inch level. So, again, some very nice signal on those soil moisture sensors that this moisture has penetrated. It's not just running off in the floods and the streams, that it's actually getting into the ground and doing a nice job of soaking the profile.
Just for the record, this past week, who really exceeded their normal rainfall?
Well, let's start at the low end first. look at the Northwest, who missed out on some of the earlier systems, they were the driest, and they had just over 4 times their normal rainfall, so 1 inch and 55 hundredths. If you look at percentages, the Southwest won the sweepstakes. They were 11 times their normal precip with an average of 3.77 inches. If you're looking at amounts, the Southeast won the sweepstakes. They averaged 6.12 inches, which was just a hair under 7 times their normal. So when we look at the year-to-date, everybody except the Northeast and the East Central is above normal for the year-to-date. If we look at the growing season, April 1st through October 9th, that's our ending of that period, everybody is above normal except the East Central. They're at 91%. But if we look at our fall moisture, which is September 1st to the present, statewide average 8 inches, and it's almost 2.5 times what we would normally expect for fall moisture.
It feels as if it's been a colder week than normal for this time of the year this past week, but you say the numbers don't support that, Mary.
Well, it depends upon where you're at. If you're in the western third of the state, yeah, it was cooler than normal, particularly in the Northwest, where they were almost 4 degrees cooler than they would typically be at this time of the year. They averaged 52.2 degrees, and that's 3.8 degrees cooler than they would typically see. Southwest, not quite so much. They were 0.7 of a degree cooler than normal, which is, when you talk normal, it's really hard to fall right on the money. They averaged 59 degrees. Central Division still cooler than normal, but again, not dramatically. The North Central was on par with the Northwest, and they were running about 3.5 degrees cooler than normal. The Eastern divisions were all warmer than they would typically be. East Central was not a whole lot warmer than normal. They ran 1.9 degrees warmer than normal, but the Southeast was averaging 7.5 degrees, almost 8 degrees warmer than they would typically be. So again, quite a range. It's also worth noting in the West Central, they probably took the cake for the extremes. They hit 101 and dropped down to 36. And again, this is just through Tuesday, so when you look at the numbers Wednesday morning, you probably had some freezing temperatures. Northwest, similarly, they had a 95 and a 33, but we know they got down below that as we moved into the week.
Last night, as a matter of fact, several hard freezing temperatures in Northwest and some drifting into North Central Kansas. But just as a footnote there, that would not be considered an early freeze for those regions, would it?
For most of the area, it's not. If you go to our freeze monitor and look at the freeze data, which stations hit freezing, they also show what the first freeze is and when the average first freeze is. As you get into North Central, some of them are a couple of days earlier than you would typically expect, not dramatically, but there. But as you go into Northwest, most of those are a day or two later than they would typically be. There were 1 or 2 that fell right on the average, but again, given the variability that we have in our freeze dates, no, it's not particularly early. The table also shows the earliest freeze dates for those areas, and all of them are in September. So you can have some really early freezes in that region.
For most of the state, though, the rainfall we've had the past week and a half, the timing isn't so great. Harvest has come to a grinding halt. Yes, not only harvest coming to that grinding halt, but wheat planting was also, not just wheat planting, but any of the fall-seeded operations that they were trying to get have basically just ended. There wasn't much activity at all this week, and not likely to get much as we start into next week. We've got rain in the forecast for the weekend. That's pretty much going to get everyone. It's not as likely to be as substantial as the previous week, but when you've already got saturated soils, it doesn't take much to keep you out of the field.
Some encouraging news on the horizon is that the 6 to 10 day precip outlook is for drier than normal, although the temperatures are likely to continue in the cooler trend. As we get into the 8 to 14 day outlook, the moisture is more favorable, drier than normal, which we would like to get, that field work going again. But we're also expecting warmer than normal temperatures, which could help finish off some of the operations that people are trying to get accomplished.
Just the ticket for those who need to get back in the fields for planting, for harvesting.
Yes. After we get through the cold that we're expecting this weekend, we are looking for moderate temperatures and dry weather for probably the next 2 weeks, and that will be a welcome change. We will truly introduce our Indian summer.
Very well. Thank you. As always, we'll catch up with you again next week.
Thanks, Eric.
That's Mary Knapp, Research and Extension Climatologist at K-State, and thanks to you likewise for being along with us. Enjoy your weekend. Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.